April 29, 1945, northern Italy. The Castelverde Valley lies bathed in the pale light of a spring morning that feels more like a dream than reality. The air smells of wet earth and burned gunpowder, and the silence is broken only by the rhythmic sound of thousands of boots marching on the dirt road that cuts through the valley like a scar. But these soldiers are not marching to attack. They are marching to surrender. The horizon is grey, not with clouds, but with the uniforms of an army that has been broken. German soldiers, elite soldiers, men who fought across 3 continents, who survived the frozen hell of Stalingrad, the scorching sands of North Africa, the hedgerows of Normandy. Men trained never to quit, never to kneel, and yet here they are, kneeling. In front of them, a Brazilian command post, a simple farmhouse with sandbags stacked around the windows and a flag snapping in the wind. Inside, officers who weeks earlier were dismissed as tropical amateurs, as carnival soldiers, are now accepting the surrender of an entire German division. 12,893 enemy soldiers, rows of Mauser rifles stacked like cordwood, hundreds of machine guns, mortars, artillery pieces arranged in fields like a museum of defeat, 2,300 vehicles, trucks, armored cars, half-tracks, parked in endless columns that stretch beyond sight. This was not supposed to happen. Not to the Americans, not to the British, not to the Soviets, but it happened to Brazil. And the story of how it happened begins not with victory, but with arrogance. The arrogance of a man named Colonel Johann Köhler. Köhler was 50 years old, a Prussian to his bones, a career officer who wore his Iron Cross like a second skin. He commanded the 162nd Infantry Division, a powerful force of 15,000 combat-hardened men, supported by panzer tanks, field artillery, and cavalry units that still used horses, because fuel was scarce, but discipline was not. His division was retreating north, racing toward the Austrian Alps, where they planned to regroup and make a final stand. The Gothic line had fallen. Mussolini was dead. Berlin was burning. But Köhler believed that if his men could cross the Montelupo River and reach the mountain passes, they could hold out for months, maybe force the Allies to negotiate. It was a plan born of desperation, but it was a plan. And then his scouts returned with news. The forces pursuing them from the south were Brazilian. Köhler actually smiled. His adjutant, Major Dieter Weiss, a lean man with a scar across his left cheek, saw the smile and understood it immediately. They both did. Brazilians. Not the Sherman tanks of Patton, not the artillery barrages of Montgomery, Brazilians. Köhler had read the intelligence reports. The Brazilian Expeditionary Force was a political gesture, a token contribution to appease the Americans. They were poorly equipped, inadequately trained, a ragtag collection of farmers and factory workers stuffed into borrowed uniforms. They had no tradition of European warfare, no legacy of military discipline. Köhler looked at his maps and calculated distances, march speeds, defensive positions. He spoke to Weiss with the calm certainty of a man who had already won. "We'll keep a rearguard to slow them down. Light skirmishes. Nothing serious. By the time they organize an attack, we'll be across the river. They'll watch us disappear into the mountains." Weiss nodded. "And if they try to engage?" Köhler's smile widened. "Then we'll teach them what real soldiers look like." What Köhler did not know, what he could not have known, was that the man pursuing him was not interested in conventional warfare. General Anselmo Valente was 54 years old, a quiet man with silver hair and a face weathered by too many sleepless nights. He did not shout, he did not swagger, he studied. While other generals barked orders and pounded tables, Valente sat in silence with maps spread before him like tarot cards, tracing roads with his fingertips, calculating angles, speeds, possibilities. He looked at the same map Köhler looked at, and he saw something different. He saw a noose. The German division was moving north toward the Montelupo River. There was only one viable crossing point near the village of San Aurora. If Köhler's forces reached that bridge, they would escape. If they escaped, they would kill more Allied soldiers in the Alps. The war would drag on, men would die, Valente would not allow it. He called his senior officers into the cramped command room at Valverde headquarters. The room smelled of coffee and cigarette smoke. A single oil lamp flickered on the table. Captain Luciana Ribeiro stood near the wall, arms crossed, her dark eyes sharp as knives. She was 33, the youngest officer in the room, and the only woman. She commanded the reconnaissance squadron. a fast-moving unit of armored cars and motorcycles that served as the eyes and ears of the division. Sergeant Rafael Antunes, 41, stood beside her. He was a veteran of the Italian campaign, a man who had seen friends die in the mountains and never spoke about it. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his posture was rigid, unbreakable. Lieutenant Samuel Gusmao, 29, sat at the radio desk, headphones around his neck, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. He was the communications officer, the man who kept the scattered units connected in a landscape where radios failed and telephone lines were cut by artillery. Valente spoke without raising his voice. Köhler is running. He thinks we're chasing him. We're not. Ribeiro raised an eyebrow. Sir? Valente traced a line on the map with his finger. If we chase him, he'll keep running. He's faster than us. Better supplied. He'll make it to the river, cross the bridge at San Aurora, and disappear into the Alps. He paused, letting the silence press down on them. We don't chase him. We get ahead of him. Antunes frowned. How? Valente's finger moved to a secondary road, a thin line that curved west through the hills. We split the force. I'll keep the main body pressing his rear so he doesn't suspect. Ribeiro, you take the reconnaissance squadron, the 6th Infantry Regiment, and every truck we can spare. You drive through the night. You take this road, he tapped the map, and you cut him off at Cedar Road, just south of San Aurora. You block the bridge. You close the door. The room went silent. Ribeiro stared at the map, her mind already calculating distances, fuel, time. General, that's a 70-kilometer drive through mountain roads, at night. If we're spotted, they'll flank us. If we break down, we're isolated. If we arrive late, they'll be across the river. Valente looked at her. If you arrive on time, we trap 15,000 enemy soldiers. Gusmao spoke quietly. And if the squadron arrives first, before the infantry catches up? Valente's expression did not change. Then Captain Ribeiro holds the line with what she has until reinforcements arrive. Ribeiro met his gaze. How many men will I have at the start? 137. The number hung in the air like a curse. Antunes broke the silence with a low whistle. 137 against 15,000. That's not a fight. That's suicide. Ribeiro did not look away from the map. It's not suicide if we don't let them know how few we are. Valente nodded. Exactly. You use mobility. You create the illusion of a larger force. You hold them long enough for the infantry to arrive. Then we tighten the noose. Gusmao leaned forward. What if Köhler decides to smash through us instead of waiting? Valente's voice was ice. Then you make him pay for every meter. Ribeiro straightened. When do we leave? Now. The room emptied quickly. Ribeiro walked into the cold night air where her squadron was already preparing. The men moved in practiced silence, loading ammunition belts into armored cars, checking fuel levels, strapping down equipment. They knew something was happening. They did not yet know what. Ribeiro climbed onto the hood of her command vehicle, an M8 Greyhound armored car with a 37mm cannon mounted on top. The men gathered around her, faces pale in the moonlight. She did not sugarcoat it. We're driving through the night to block the German retreat. We'll arrive before the infantry. That means for a few hours, maybe longer, it's just us. 137 men holding a road against an entire division. Someone in the back muttered a curse. Ribeiro ignored it. They outnumber us. They have more guns, more tanks, more experience, but they don't know we're coming. And when we hit them hard. We move fast, we shoot straight, and we do not break. She paused, scanning their faces. If any man here wants to stay behind, speak now. No judgment, no shame. No one moved. Ribeiro nodded. Good. Mount up. We leave in 5 minutes. The convoy rolled out into the darkness. 32 vehicles. Armored cars, jeeps, trucks loaded with infantry, snaking through the narrow mountain roads with headlights off to avoid detection. The drivers navigated by moonlight and memory, gripping their steering wheels with white knuckles as the road twisted and climbed. Ribeiro rode in the lead vehicle, standing in the open turret, scanning the horizon. The cold wind bit at her face. Behind her, Antunes sat in the gunner's seat, hands resting on the 37mm cannon. He had been quiet since they left. Finally, he spoke. You ever think about what happens if we don't make it? Ribeiro kept her eyes on the road. All the time. And I keep driving. Antunes smiled faintly. Fair enough. The convoy moved like a ghost through the Italian night. They passed through silent villages where windows were shuttered and dogs barked at the rumble of engines. They climbed hills where the road narrowed to a single lane, and the drop-off on one side fell into blackness. Twice, a truck stalled and had to be pushed. Once, a jeep blew a tire and had to be abandoned, but they kept moving. Ribeiro checked her watch every 10 minutes. They had to reach Cedar Road by dawn. If they arrived too late, Köhler's advance units would already be past the checkpoint. If they arrived too early, they would have to hold the position for hours without support. Timing was everything. At 400 hours, they crested a hill and saw it. The valley below, the river glinting silver in the moonlight, and the road, Cedar Road, cutting straight through the valley like a vein. Ribeiro raised her fist. The convoy stopped. She climbed out of the vehicle and walked to the edge of the hill, crouching low. Through binoculars, she could see the bridge at San Aurora, a stone arch spanning the Montelupo River. Beyond it, the road disappeared into the mountains. If Köhler reached that bridge, he escaped. If Ribeiro held this position, he was trapped. She lowered the binoculars and turned to Antunes. "We're here. Now we dig in." The men worked quickly, positioning the armored cars on the high ground overlooking the road, spreading infantry squads across the hillsides to create overlapping fields of fire. They used the terrain, boulders, tree lines, low walls, to conceal their positions and make their small force appear larger. Ribeiro walked the line, checking each position, adjusting angles, issuing quiet orders. By the time the sun began to rise, they were ready. And then, in the distance, they heard it. The low rumble of engines, the clanking of tank treads. The German division was coming. Ribeiro climbed back into her command vehicle and picked up the radio handset. "All units, this is Falcon 1. Enemy contact imminent. Hold fire until my command. Make every shot count." She set the handset down and looked at Antunes. He was already loading the cannon. "You scared?" she asked. Antunes grinned. "Terrified." "Good. So am I." The rumble grew louder. The first German vehicles appeared on the road below. Motorcycle scouts, followed by trucks, followed by the dark silhouettes of armored vehicles. They moved confidently, without caution. They did not expect resistance. Ribeiro waited until the lead vehicles were directly below her position. Then she keyed the radio. "All units, fire!" The hillside erupted. The 37mm cannon on Ribeiro's armored car barked, and the lead German motorcycle exploded in a ball of flame. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions, raking the column with tracer fire that looked like red fireflies in the dawn light. The Germans scrambled for cover, diving off trucks, dragging wounded men into ditches. Radios crackled with panicked German voices, and in the chaos, Ribeiro's vehicles moved. They fired from one position, then relocated, fired again from a different angle, creating the illusion of a much larger force. For the first 30 minutes, it worked. The Germans, caught off guard, assumed they had run into a major defensive line. They deployed infantry, called for artillery support, began organizing a coordinated assault. But then a German officer, a sharp-eyed lieutenant, noticed something. The fire was coming from the same vehicles, just repositioned. There were not hundreds of Brazilians. There were dozens. The lieutenant radioed back to Colonel Köhler. "Sir, the blocking force is small, very small. We can break through." Köhler, sitting in his command car several kilometers back, felt a flash of anger. How had the Brazilians gotten ahead of him? It did not matter. He had tanks, he had numbers. He issued the order. Crush them. The German assault began with precision and fury. 3 Panzer IV tanks rolled forward, their 75mm guns swiveling toward the Brazilian positions. Behind them, infantry advanced in textbook formation, using the terrain for cover, leapfrogging between positions. Köhler had committed 2 full battalions, over 1,600 men, to smash through what he believed was a thin defensive line. He expected it to take 30 minutes. He was wrong. The Brazilians did not fight like Europeans. They did not hold fixed positions and wait to be overrun. They moved. Ribeiro's armored cars darted between firing positions like hornets, appearing on one flank, firing, then vanishing before the Germans could return effective fire. Her infantry squads used the hillside terrain to devastating effect, firing from concealed positions, then melting back into the trees. The Germans advanced, yes, but every meter cost them blood. A panzer tank crested a rise and was immediately hit by concentrated fire from 3 different angles. A 37mm armor-piercing round punched through its thinner side armor, and the tank erupted in flames, its crew scrambling out into the open, where machine gun fire cut them down. The German infantry, seeing their armor burning, hesitated. That hesitation was fatal. Ribeiro's men had learned from months of combat in the Italian mountains that hesitation creates gaps, and gaps create opportunities. They poured fire into the stalled German advance, forcing them to take cover, disrupting their coordination. For 2 hours, the battle raged. The hillside echoed with the staccato bark of machine guns, the deep boom of cannons, the sharp crack of rifles. Smoke drifted across the valley like fog, and then Ribeiro's radio crackled. It was Sergeant Antunes, his voice tight with strain. "Falcon 1, we're running low on ammunition. 40% remaining on the heavy guns. 20% on the rifles." Ribeiro felt her stomach tighten. She had known this moment would come. They had held longer than expected, inflicted heavier casualties than any German officer would believe possible, but they were outnumbered, outgunned, and running out of bullets. She glanced at her watch. The 6th Infantry Regiment should have arrived by now. Should have. But the roads were treacherous, and delays were inevitable. She keyed the radio. "All units, conserve ammunition. Fire only when you have a clear shot. Make every round count." She did not say what they all knew, that if the Germans realized how desperate the Brazilian position was, they would charge en masse and overrun them in minutes. Down below, in the command vehicle of the German column, Colonel Köhler stood over a field map. His jaw clenched so tight it ached. Major Weiss stood beside him, holding a radio handset, listening to reports from the front. The news was not good. "Sir, 3rd Battalion reports 63 casualties. 4th Battalion reports 41. 2 tanks destroyed, 1 disabled. Estimated enemy strength, unknown." Köhler slammed his fist on the map. "Unknown? How can it be unknown? We've been fighting them for 2 hours." Weiss lowered the radio. "Sir, the enemy keeps moving. Our forward observers report seeing armored cars in multiple locations, but they can't establish an accurate count. The terrain favors them. They're dug in on high ground." Köhler stared at the map, his mind racing. He had spent his entire career fighting enemies who stood and held ground, Russians who dug trenches and died in place, British who formed defensive squares. These Brazilians were different. They fought like ghosts, but ghosts could not hold forever. He turned to Weiss. "Order a full divisional assault. Every available unit, infantry, armor, artillery. We hit them with everything. Overwhelm them with numbers. I don't care if it costs us 200 men. We break through or we're trapped here when the rest of the Allied forces arrive." Weiss hesitated. "Sir, if we commit everything to the assault and fail, we won't fail." Köhler's voice was ice. "Because they're Brazilians, and Brazilians break." The order went out. Across the German column, engines roared to life. Soldiers fixed bayonets. Artillery pieces were unlimbered and aimed at the hillside. And then, at 1400 hours, the assault began. It was not a battle. It was a tsunami. Ribeiro saw it coming. She stood in the turret of her armored car, binoculars pressed to her eyes, and watched the German line surge forward like a steel wave. Hundreds of men, dozens of vehicles. The earth itself seemed to shake. She lowered the binoculars and keyed the radio one last time. Her voice was calm, almost gentle. "All units, this is it. Hold your positions. Do not retreat. If we break, they escape. If we hold, we win. So we hold." She set the radio down and looked at Antunes. He was loading the last belt of ammunition into the machine gun. His hands were steady. "You ready?" she asked. He grinned, though his eyes were haunted. "Hell no." "Good. Neither am I." The German wave crashed into the Brazilian line. The noise was apocalyptic. Explosions ripped through the hillside. Bullets snapped through the air like angry wasps. Men screamed. Vehicles burned. Ribeiro's armored car was hit twice, once by rifle fire that sparked off the armor plating, once by a mortar round that landed close enough to lift the rear wheels off the ground. The vehicle slammed back down, and Ribeiro's head snapped forward, splitting her lip. Blood filled her mouth. She spat it out and kept firing. Around her, the Brazilian line bent. Men fell. Positions were overrun. A German squad reached the top of the hill and engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat with Brazilian infantry. It was chaos. It was slaughter. And then, through the smoke and fire, Ribeiro heard something. A sound that made her heart leap. The roar of diesel engines. Heavy engines. She spun around and saw them, trucks cresting the hill behind her. The 6th Infantry Regiment. They had arrived. The trucks skidded to a halt, and soldiers poured out like water from a broken dam. Fresh troops, loaded with ammunition, angry and ready to fight. Lieutenant Samuel Gusmo jumped from the lead truck, radio pack on his back, and sprinted toward Ribeiro's position. He was shouting into the handset as he ran. "Falcon 1, this is Eagle 6. We're here, what do you need?" Ribeiro wiped blood from her mouth and pointed at the German line. "Everything. Hit them with everything." Gusmão nodded and began directing the incoming artillery. Within minutes, Brazilian howitzers were firing from the rear positions, their shells screaming overhead and slamming into the German advance. The tide turned. Köhler felt the shift immediately. The resistance that had been weakening suddenly solidified. Then it strengthened. His radio exploded with panicked reports. "Enemy reinforcements. Artillery fire incoming. Request permission to withdraw." Köhler stood frozen, his mind unable to process what was happening. They had been so close to breaking through. And now Weiss grabbed his arm. "Sir, we need to pull back, regroup. If we stay here, we'll be destroyed." Köhler shook his head slowly, as if waking from a dream. "Pull back? To where?" Weiss pointed at the map. "We circle west. Find another crossing point. There is no other crossing point." The voice came from behind them. Both men turned. Standing at the entrance to the command vehicle was a figure neither of them expected. Father Giacomo Bellini. The old priest was 61 years old, dressed in a worn black cassock stained with mud and ash. His face was lined with age, but his eyes burned with an intensity that made Köhler take a step back. The priest had appeared seemingly from nowhere, walking through the battlefield as if bullets and shells were mere inconveniences. "Who the hell are you?" Köhler demanded. "And how did you get past my sentries?" The priest smiled faintly. "I am Father Bellini. I serve the Church of San Aurora, and I came to deliver a message." Weiss drew his sidearm, but Köhler raised a hand, stopping him. There was something about the old man's presence, something unsettling. "What message?" Köhler asked. Father Bellini stepped closer, his voice low and steady. "The valley is closed, Colonel. The bridge you seek is held. The roads you need are blocked. You are surrounded, but there is still a way out." Köhler's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The priest reached into his cassock and pulled out a small weathered wooden cross. He held it up between them. "3 nights ago, I had a vision. I saw this valley filled with the dead, German, Brazilian, Italian, thousands of corpses rotting in the spring sun. I saw mothers weeping, children orphaned, a wasteland born of pride." He lowered the cross. "But I also saw another path, a path where no more men die, where soldiers lay down their arms and walk home to their families." Köhler stared at him. "You're insane." "Perhaps," the priest said quietly, "but I am also right. Look at your map, Colonel. Look at where you are. You cannot advance. You cannot retreat. The only question left is how many of your men die before you accept the truth." Weiss stepped forward. "This is nonsense. We're soldiers. We don't surrender because of some priest's fever dream." Father Bellini turned his gaze to Weiss. "So you have a wife, Major. Her name is Greta. She lives in Hamburg. You have not heard from her in 6 months, and you fear she is dead." Weiss went pale. "How do you—" "Because I see things," the priest said simply. "Things that are, things that will be. And I see you, Major, standing at a crossroads. One path leads home. The other leads to a shallow grave in Italian soil." The silence in the command vehicle was absolute. Köhler finally spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "What do you want from us?" Father Bellini placed the cross back in his cassock. "I want you to stop, to lay down your arms, to save the lives of the men who trust you." Köhler laughed bitterly. "And if I refuse?" The priest's expression did not change. "Then by dawn, this valley will be your tomb." He turned and walked out of the vehicle, disappearing into the smoke and chaos as mysteriously as he had arrived. Köhler stood in silence for a long moment. Then he turned to Weiss. "Get me a map of the entire region, every road, every trail, every crossing point." Weiss nodded and spread the map on the table. Köhler studied it, his finger tracing lines, calculating distances, searching for options. But the more he looked, the clearer the truth became. The Brazilians held Cedar Road. The Montelupo River was too deep to ford anywhere except at the bridge. The mountain passes were controlled by Allied forces. There was no way out. Weiss saw it too. "What do we do, sir?" Köhler closed his eyes. He thought of his men. 15,000 soldiers who had followed him across continents, who had trusted him to lead them home. He thought of his wife, waiting in Berlin. He thought of the Iron Cross on his chest, and he thought of Father Bellini's words, a crossroads. He opened his eyes. Send a message to the Brazilian command. Request terms for negotiation. Weiss stared at him. Sir, do it. Köhler's voice was steel. Before I change my mind. The message reached General Valente's headquarters 2 hours later. Valente read it twice, then set it down on the table and looked at his officers. Captain Ribeiro was there, her face streaked with dirt and dried blood, her uniform torn. Lieutenant Gusmão stood beside her, radio still strapped to his back. Sergeant Antunes leaned against the wall, exhausted. Valente spoke quietly. Colonel Köhler is requesting terms. He wants to negotiate a ceasefire. The room erupted. Officers shouted, arguing over whether to accept, whether to press the advantage, whether this was a trick. Valente raised his hand, and the room fell silent. There will be no negotiation, he said. We will not bargain with them. We will not give them time to regroup or escape. There is only one acceptable outcome. He looked at Ribeiro. Captain, prepare a message for Colonel Köhler. Tell him he has 2 options. Unconditional surrender of all personnel and equipment by dawn tomorrow. Or total annihilation. No middle ground. Ribeiro smiled grimly. Yes, sir. As the officers filed out to prepare, Valente stood alone in the command room staring at the map. He did not feel triumph. He felt exhaustion and a quiet, profound sadness for all the men, German, Brazilian, Italian, who had died in this valley because of pride, politics, and the insanity of war. Outside, the sun was setting. The valley was quiet, and somewhere in that silence, the fate of 15,000 men hung in the balance. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the cost of war and the weight of leadership, don't just watch and leave. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in General Valente's position. Would you have risked everything on that audacious plan? And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Because history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about human beings making impossible choices, and we're going to keep telling those stories. The morning of April 30th, 1945, broke over the Castelverde Valley with an eerie stillness. The air was cold, crystalline, and smelled of wet grass and smoke. The guns had fallen silent. The battlefield, which hours before had roared with violence, now lay quiet as a cemetery. Captain Luciana Ribeiro stood on the hilltop, watching the sun rise over the sacred hollow hills. Her uniform was filthy, torn at the shoulder where shrapnel had grazed her. Her hands were wrapped in blood-stained bandages. She had not slept in 37 hours, but she was still standing. Below her, stretching as far as the eye could see, was a sight that no Allied officer, American, British, or Soviet, had witnessed in the entire Italian campaign. The German surrender. It was not a trickle. It was a flood. Thousands of men emerged from the tree lines, from foxholes, from hidden positions along the valley floor. They came on foot, on horseback, on trucks with engines sputtering and coughing. They came in columns that stretched for kilometers, grey-green uniforms blending into the landscape like a river of ghosts. They did not march with pride. They shuffled, heads down, rifles slung over shoulders or dragging in the dirt. The sound was haunting, the scrape of boots on gravel, the jingle of equipment, the occasional cough or muttered word in German, but mostly silence. Ribeiro watched them come, her face expressionless. Beside her, Sergeant Rafael Antunes let out a low whistle. Jesus Christ, he murmured. How many are there? Lieutenant Samuel Gusmão stood nearby, counting vehicles through binoculars. His voice was hoarse. I've counted over 2,000 trucks and cars so far. Still more coming. Ribeiro shook her head slowly. We held the line with 137 men. Antunes laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. We're either the bravest sons of bitches alive or the craziest. Both, Ribeiro said quietly. Down below, at the command post that had been hastily set up in an old farmhouse, the formal surrender was about to take place. General Anselmo Valente stood in the main room, hands clasped behind his back, staring out the window at the endless column of prisoners. He looked exhausted. His face was lined with deep creases, his eyes shadowed, but his posture was straight, unbroken. An aide entered and saluted. Sir, the German commanders are here. Valente nodded. Show them in. The door opened, and two men entered. Colonel Johann Köhler wore his full dress uniform, immaculate despite the circumstances, boots polished to a mirror shine, the Iron Cross gleaming on his chest. But his face was ashen, his jaw tight with suppressed humiliation. Behind him, Major Dieter Weiss looked haunted, his eyes distant as if he were watching events from far away. They stopped in the center of the room and came to attention. Köhler saluted stiffly. Valente did not return the salute immediately. He studied them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, not respect. Colonel Köhler, Major Weiss, you requested terms. There are none. You will surrender all personnel, all equipment, all vehicles and all weapons, immediately and unconditionally. Your men will be treated in accordance with the Geneva Convention. They will be fed, sheltered and processed as prisoners of war. But there will be no negotiation. Köhler's jaw worked. When he spoke, his voice was tight, controlled. My men have fought honorably. They deserve— Your men, Valente interrupted quietly, deserve to go home alive. That is what I am offering them. Take it. The room fell silent. Köhler stared at Valente, and for the first time something cracked in his expression. The arrogance, the pride, the certainty, all of it fell away, leaving only exhaustion. He reached up slowly and removed the Iron Cross from his uniform. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, then set it on the table between them. I surrender my command, he said. His voice was hollow. Valente looked at the medal, then at Köhler. You may keep that. You earned it, whatever else you've done. What I want is your word that your men will comply peacefully. Köhler nodded once. You have it. Valente turned to an aide. Process them. Treat them well. As the German officers were led out, Major Weiss paused at the door. He looked back at Valente. General, the priest, Father Bellini. Did you send him? Valente frowned. I don't know any priest. Weiss stared at him, searching for deception. He found none. He knew things. Things he couldn't have known. Valente's expression softened slightly. Maybe some things aren't meant to be explained, Major. Maybe some things just are. Weiss nodded slowly, then turned and walked out. Outside, the surrender continued. Brazilian soldiers directed the German prisoners to open fields where weapons were being collected. The piles grew monstrously tall, rifles stacked like firewood, machine guns in rows, helmets heaped in mounds that glittered dully in the morning sun. 2,300 vehicles were parked in vast lots, engines cooling, abandoned. 87 artillery pieces sat silent, their barrels pointed at nothing. It was the graveyard of an army. Among the prisoners, a young German soldier, no more than 19, with blonde hair and frightened eyes, approached a Brazilian guard. He spoke in broken Italian. Water, please? The Brazilian soldier, himself only 22, looked at him for a moment. Then he pulled out his canteen and handed it over. The German drank deeply, gratefully, then handed it back. Danke, he whispered. The Brazilian nodded. Go sit with the others. Someone will bring food soon. The young German walked away, and the Brazilian watched him go. He thought of his own younger brother back home in São Paulo. He wondered if that German boy had a brother too. He wondered how many brothers were not going home from this war. He lit a cigarette and turned away. At the edge of the prisoner encampment, Father Giacomo Bellini walked among the men. He carried no weapon, no flag, just his wooden cross and a small bag of bread. He stopped at groups of soldiers, German, Italian, even a few Brazilian wounded being treated nearby, and he offered bread, water, a word of comfort. One German officer, a captain with a bandaged head, looked up at him. You're the priest, the one who came to our command post. Father Bellini smiled gently. I am. The captain shook his head. How did you know those things about Major Weiss's wife? The priest sat down beside him. I told you. I see things. That's not an answer. Father Bellini looked out at the valley, at the soldiers resting in the grass, at the sun climbing higher. When I was a young man, I did not believe in visions. I believed in bread, in work, in the soil beneath my feet. Then the war came. I saw things no man should see. Villages burned, children starving. And one night, in the ruins of a church, I prayed for understanding, and something answered. The captain stared at him. What answered? I don't know, the priest said honestly. God, perhaps, or something older. But it showed me that every choice we make echoes forward and backward through time, that every act of mercy creates light, and every act of cruelty creates shadow. He turned to the captain. Your colonel chose mercy. He chose life over pride. That is why you are sitting here breathing instead of rotting in the dirt. Remember that. The captain was silent for a long time. Then he nodded. Father Bellini patted his shoulder and stood. He walked on, disappearing into the crowd of men. By midday, the final counts were complete. 12,893 prisoners, 2,314 vehicles, 87 artillery pieces, hundreds of machine guns, mortars, and small arms. It was the largest single surrender in the Italian theater, the only time an entire German division had capitulated to a single Allied force. The news spread like wildfire through the Allied command. General Mark Clark, commander of the U.S. Fifth Army, read the report 3 times before he believed it. The Brazilians? He said to his aide. The Brazilians did this? Yes, sir. Clark shook his head slowly. I'll be damned. He immediately sent a message to General Valente. Magnificent work. You have written your names in history. Back at Valverde headquarters, Valente received the message and set it aside without comment. He walked out into the afternoon sun and found Captain Ribeiro sitting on the steps of the farmhouse, cleaning her rifle. She looked up as he approached. Captain, sir, how are your men? Tired, proud, confused why no one back home seems to care. Valente sat down beside her. They will care, eventually. History remembers, even when people forget. Ribeiro smiled faintly. You think so? I know so. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the sun move across the sky. Finally, Valente spoke again. What you did yesterday, holding that line with 137 men, that was either brilliant or insane. Ribeiro laughed quietly. Both, sir. Valente smiled. Good. The best soldiers always are. The story of the Castelverde Valley spread beyond military reports. It reached newspapers in Rio, São Paulo, and beyond. But the coverage was muted. The Brazilian government, led by a dictator who feared soldiers with too much confidence, downplayed the victory. Veterans returning home found themselves ignored, dismissed, forgotten. Many struggled to find work. Some were told they were lying about their service. The heroes who captured an entire German division were treated like ghosts. But the truth does not die. It waits. And decades later, historians would uncover the records, the testimonies, the photographs of that morning in April 1945. They would see the rows of surrendered soldiers, the mountains of weapons, the face of Colonel Köhler handing over his command, and they would ask the question that should have been asked from the beginning. How did they do it? The answer was simple. They did it with courage, with strategy, with audacity, with 137 men who refused to break, with a general who saw the board 3 moves ahead, with a priest who believed in mercy over violence. They did it because they had no other choice, and because they were Brazilian. The lesson of Castelverde is universal. Underestimate your enemy at your peril. Judge people by stereotypes and you will lose. Arrogance is the mother of defeat, and sometimes the greatest victories come not from overwhelming force, but from refusing to quit when every rational calculation says you should. If this story moved your heart, if it made you think about courage, sacrifice, and the cost of freedom, please don't just close this video and move on. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, what country, what city. We want to know this story is reaching people around the world. And tell us, what did you learn from this? Did you know Brazil fought in World War II? Did you know about this incredible victory? Hit that subscribe button if you want more stories like this. Stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Stories that history tried to bury but that deserve to be told. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. And never forget, the greatest victories are often won by those the world underestimated.